my pleasure to introduce Larry Nielsen, Professor Emeritus of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. He retired in 2018. It's been even busier since then. It's been a retirement from over.
He sounds like my boss.
4 decades of work, much of which has been an administrative role, I would say. Is that accurate, Larry?
Yeah.
Half and half, maybe?
Okay.
All right. He's led several key roles, most recently Provost and Executive Vice Chancellor at NC State. Before that, Dean of the College of Natural Resources at NC State, Director of School of Forest Resources at Penn State, where I was an undergraduate when he was the chair. Head of Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. Terrible student. I just barely made it through. They just got rid of me. I was
just in trouble.
just moving me along. Before that, he served on many national and international panels, president of American Fisheries Society, president of the National Association for University Fisheries and Wildlife Program, co-chaired the first World Fisheries Congress in Athens, Greece. He's been a prolific author of books and papers, most recently more books than papers, Ecosystem Management, Provost, Nature's Allies, and then a couple fun reads. Yeah, right there. You can get your copy on Amazon.
You can get your copy from me at the end.
That's right. And then cut out Amazon. Wolfpack Ramblings, Dead Man on Campus, a fun read. I have a signed copy. I enjoyed it thoroughly. Other honors, Kellogg National Fellow, honorary member of American Fisheries Society, Excellence in Fisheries Education Awards, Sustainable Achievement Awards, and Natural Resources from the Renewable Natural Resources Foundation. So I didn't hit many of the major points, but I think that's probably enough, Larry.
Thank you.
And let's welcome Larry. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Andy. I knew Andy when he was in diapers, so or the honored Professor Finley. And thank you all for coming today. I appreciate it. Now, a couple of things. One is, I'm an old man, and it's almost lunchtime, but I have to do this before we eat. And so I might get hungry, and so I brought my muscle milk with, in case I, need a little sustenance, whatever that word is, during the thing. So, and besides, you don't get this without a lot of muscle milk. So, the topic of my presentation today is lessons from the great conservationists of the past. And Andy said a lot of nice things about me, but the only thing you really need to know about me is that I'm an optimist. I believe the world's a better place today than it was yesterday, and it'll be a better place tomorrow than it is today. And as proof of the fact that that's the way I think, that's the way I live, recognize that for the last 77 years, I've been a Chicago Cubs fan. And that takes a true optimist to maintain that. But the proof that it's the right approach to life is that every so often, you actually get what you're hoping for. And it was only 108 years between world championships for the Cubs. So, of course, optimism works. And, playoffs start tomorrow. And the Cubs are in it, and it could be our year again this year. Now, being optimistic, if you're in conservation or natural resource environmental areas, sometimes can be hard. As our friend Aldo Leopold is known to have said, that being an ecologist means that you live alone in a world of wounds. Now, I love Aldo Leopold and what he accomplished on our behalf and the things he said and thought. But I disagree with him about that. That I think recognizing that the world exists with all of us as it should, and that it has the potential to be better all the time is more important than feeling bad about some things that have happened. And to give you an example, in 1969, the Cuyahoga River over there in your neighborhood of Ohio burst into flames, started on fire. That wasn't the first time that it happened, but it was a very significant event. And many people considered that to be at least the symbolic start of the modern environmental movement. And in the last 60, however many years, since that happened, much change has occurred. We have great laws that protect our air and our water and our endangered species and other things. And, you know, today, the Cuyahoga River is a much different place than it was in 1969. The river is now fishable and swimmable. I wouldn't drink it if I were you yet. And I'm not trying to suggest that you should have your honeymoon in the Cuyahoga River alongside it, but I am suggesting that this is an example of what we've accomplished in the last 60 years. And it's happened here, and it's happened over and over and over again. People are paying attention, good things are happening. Now, to get this idea across to my students and also to others in the world, I wrote the book Nature's Allies, which Aki has here, and I don't know why I want to hold it up. It looks just like the picture. And the idea there was to present some examples of the lives of people who have made the world a better place. And in the book, I feature the lives of 8 individuals, some of whom you know and recognize, and maybe some of whom you don't know. There's John Muir, of course, the so-called father of conservation, Rachel Carson, and I would note, and Aldo Leopold. Now, those 3 everybody knows, but the others may be less familiar to most of you. Wangari Maathai from Kenya, Chico Mendes, Gro Harlem Brundtland, the former Prime Minister of Norway, who wrote the definition of sustainability that we use across the world today. Billy Frank Jr. and Ding Darling, the best friend that Duck ever had. But I was reminded, preparing for this, that it was just 2 days ago in 1963, September 27th of 1963, when Silent Spring came out. Another symbolic beginning to the modern environmental movement. Now, when I was working on these biographies, I was trying to think, what do these people, excuse me, what do these people have in common? What is it that had allowed them to make the impact that they have? Were they all scientists? Were they well educated? Did they come from, I don't know, musical families, whatever it might be? And I couldn't find anything of that nature that united. But I did find what I thought were 3 characteristics that they all shared. Now, the first of those is passion. Each of these people was passionately committed to making the world a better place by improving their environment around them. But we all know that passion can burn up white hot for a while and then cool off very quickly. It happens in romances sometimes, right? Fortunately for me, it hasn't. Because just 4 days ago was the 55th anniversary of when I married this lovely woman, right? So the passion has got to stay if you're going to make a difference. So the second characteristic that I found was persistence. The folks who I'm going to talk about didn't give up the first time it didn't go well, or the second time, or the 10th time, or maybe the 40th time. They kept at it, committed their lives, everything they had to making this passionate difference in the world. And the third characteristic is partnerships. We all know that if you bring other people together, working together, we can accomplish so much more than we can on our own. So passion, persistence, and partnerships, I think, characterize the ability to make a big difference in the world. Now, I wish I could talk about all 8 of these people today, but we only have 3 hours together, so I can't cover them all. So And besides, why would you buy the book if I don't? And just to make it clear, I have brought some books with, because people always ask me afterward, do you have books to sign or whatever? So I do. And they're for sale at a substantial discount from Amazon. Because I get a little break from the publisher. So today I'm going to talk just about three people. I'm going to talk about Chico Mendes, then Billy Frank Jr., and finally Wangari Maathai. So three people I'm going to cover. And so now you know how to gauge where we are in the presentation, right? Because I'm going to talk about three lives. And don't you hate it when you're sitting out there in the audience and the speaker says, well, I have 5 points I want to make today. Point number one, and then they go on for like 45 minutes and you're sitting there waiting. Come on, where's number two? Where's point number two going to get here? And so you know when we switch to a new life, we're a third of the way, right? You're with me? Yeah. First, I want to talk to you about Chico Mendes. Chico Mendes was a Brazilian rubber tapper. He was poor, he was uneducated, lived in the far western state of Acre in Brazil. Now, when I say he was poor and was a rubber tapper, he really was. He grew up, he'd like to say that when other children were learning their ABCs, I was learning how to coax the white milky sap out of the rubber tree. So he was illiterate. He couldn't do arithmetic. He couldn't read and write. Knew nothing except what he had to do every day, which was to go out, take a long hike through the forest, get to each of the rubber trees on this path, carve a little groove in the rubber tree, hang a little pot to collect the sap that would drip out. Go home, have lunch, come back, and with a big bucket, empty those little buckets, bring it back, and in the evening, cook it over an open fire so that they had like a basketball size of latex that could be sold. And that's what he did 6 days a week from the time he was about 10 years old. Until one day, a stranger walked out of the forest into their clearing who took Chico Mendes as a mentee, and changed his life. Taught him how to read and write, do arithmetic. Had him read newspapers, talked to him about politics and social justice and the way the world ought to be. And that changed Chico Mendes' life, because he began at that point to understand that the rubber tappers and the others that lived in the rural areas of Brazil were being cheated by people that bought things from them, that their life was not the way it should be. And he formed the first labor union to represent the rubber tappers and other rural workers in Western Brazil. And through that, and working with the Catholic Church, in partnership with the Catholic Church, he began a process where they built schools, medical clinics, helped the local population learn to read and write so they wouldn't be cheated so much. And he became really an advocate for social justice and for the rainforest. Now, we're talking about, he was born in 1944, and now it's the early 60s. And the nation of Brazil has decided that the rainforest was a waste of space, and that they should cut the trees down and turn the forest into pasture for cattle, and then eventually into soybean fields. Chico Mendes realized that if the forest was cut down and hauled away, that there wouldn't be a capacity for them to tap rubber, to collect Brazil nuts, to live sustainable lives in those forests. And so he began to fight not only for the health and welfare of the workers, but also for the health and welfare of the forest. He became an advocate for both of those things. Now, oh yeah, I always forget the slide in there. And in order to do this, he created this idea called an empate, which is a nonviolent protest held in the forest. So when the announcement came out that a certain chunk of land was going to be harvested and turned into a pasture, he would gather together hundreds of local rubber tappers, and they would go and have a protest and sit in and stop this from happening. But he never allowed there to be violence. He never carried a weapon, although it was dangerous work that he was doing. He was called the Gandhi of the forest because of his nonviolent nature and the way he managed people. And there was a charisma about Chico Mendes that made people follow him. Now, as this was going on in Brazil, the developed world was beginning to be concerned about the Amazon rainforest here in the late 1960s. And they realized that the rainforests were doing the good things we know that they were doing. But they also realized that it wasn't enough to have a bunch of elites from the developed world complaining about what was happening down in Central and South America. But they needed a charismatic local person that could represent what was happening down there to the people of the world. And they found that in Chico Mendes. This fellow, Stephen Schwartz from the Environmental Defense Fund, went down to Brazil because he'd heard about Chico Mendes. And together they formed a partnership that they would work together on behalf of the rubber tappers, on behalf of the forest. And Steve Schwartzman brought Chico Mendes to the United States, and they nominated him for some awards, and he did some speaking. The interesting thing, Chico Mendes, like I said, was always poor. And when he was going to come up to the United States, he didn't have any clothes, you know, that were suitable for getting on an airplane and going to a big international meeting. So he went to the local Catholic charity shop in town. And they dug around in their bins of used clothes, and they found a suit that almost fit him. And you know, he was a short guy. He was stocky, and so you can see he's sort of draped in this suit coat and stuff. You know, no sartorial splendor there. But when he looked terrible, but when he started to speak, people listened. And he went to Congress and talked about the rainforest, and he went to the World Bank, and he went to the International Monetary Fund and talked to these people about what was happening in the forest and convinced them that they should change their policies to protect the forest rather than to destroy the forest. And I like this quote from Chico Mendes where he said, "At first I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I'm fighting for humanity." But he wasn't going to stay away. He always went back to his little home in the town of Yacapuri in Acre, Brazil, and as his home base. And this little house that he lived in all his life had no running water. It had one electric light bulb hanging from a wire in the middle of the main room. He was truly poor. He got none of this stuff he did for himself. He did it for others. Now, one evening, it was time for dinner, and his wife said, "Chico, go have a shower, come back so we can eat." So he threw a towel over his shoulder and went out the back door because the shower was down at the bottom of the yard. There was a pipe down. He walked out, and 2 shotgun blasts came out of the woods, penetrated his chest, and he fell backwards and died on the steps of his home. A martyr for the cause that he was committed to his whole life. Now, the people who shot him and arranged to have him shot thought that this would end the movement that Chico Mendes had created and was building, but they were wrong. At his funeral, a few days later, there were 4,000 people came from all over the world to recognize this man and what he had done on behalf of all of us. And today, still, that little house with a better paint job is a memorial to Chico Mendes, where thousands of people a year come pay homage to the effects of this humble, poor, uneducated man and what he managed to do in order to getting the Amazon rainforest on the radar screen. And you know, if you look at deforestation of the Amazon, you know, this is when he died, and the impact wasn't immediate, but others, you know, continued on that. And then about in the early 2000s, when there was a change in the government of Brazil, and a new policy was enacted that said we are going to reforest instead of deforest, and the rates of deforestation have dropped way down. And there's a little bit of uptick in the last few years because Bolsonaro didn't like that idea, but guess what? Bolsonaro's in jail. And the folks who did this, President Lula, is now back in charge. And I think we're going to continue to see a reduction in the loss of the Amazon rainforest. And so my hope and my belief is that this is the forest that will remain in our future rather than one that has no trees and no hope for us. All right, so that's Chico Mendes. 1/3 done. Easy to keep track. But now I want to talk to you about this fella, Billy Frank Jr., who was a Native American salmon fisherman from the state of Washington. Died a few years ago. It's interesting, when I started writing this book, there were 3 people that I wrote about were still alive. Now there's just one. And people have been writing to me and said, don't feature me in your book. So Billy Frank Jr., you know, what Billy Frank Jr. accomplished is really changed the way fisheries were managed, both in the Pacific Northwest and around the world. But the story begins a lot earlier. Now, Billy Frank Jr. was a member of the Nisqually people, one of 20 small groups in Northwest Washington state. Now, if we go back to the 1750s, the United States powers that be had just begun to pay attention to this area and decided that they wanted more people from the East to come out there and farm, and created a law that allowed land to be given away free to folks. That was a problem, however. This land all belonged to the Native Americans. So treaties had to be signed with the Native American people with the federal government, so that the land could be turned over to the U.S. government, then given out to individual settlers. The first treaty that was signed in 1854 out in this area was with the Nisqually people and a couple of other groups together at a place called the Treaty Tree, where the Native Americans used to get together and have their discussions about whatever they needed to talk about. So in Christmas of 1854, 1854, the representatives of the federal government got together with the Native Americans, who didn't read English, but they talked through translators, and there were 600 Native Americans gathered here with representatives of the federal government. And they created this treaty. Now, this is what the treaty looked like, which is a bunch of words. You can't read them because it's fuzzy, but they couldn't read them because it made no sense to them. But this was a treaty just like all the others that we're now aware of and used to, which is it gave away the Indian lands, took the lands away from them, changed their native customs, the way they live, and created other issues for the Native Americans. But this particular treaty, this one that was signed with the Nisqually people, had one clause in it that it turned out to be really, really important. And it was this: the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed grounds and stations is further secured to said Indians. What that meant was that the Native American fishermen could fish where they wanted. They could fish any way they wanted, any time they wanted, and take as many fish as they wanted. Which was their right in this treaty. That was fine for 100 years. No one really cared. no one really cared except the Native Americans, of course, because if you hear Billy Frank Jr. tell the story, the salmon is part of us. We caught the salmon, we ate the salmon, we sold the salmon. Our customs, our livelihoods, our economy was all based on our ability to catch and utilize these fish. And it wasn't a problem, there were enough fish. Until after World War II, when things started to get tough. The fish stocks began to drop. Fish abundance went way down for lots of reasons. There were more dams built, and you know what dams do to salmon, stops them going one way and stops them going the other way. More pollution. Timber harvest was going right down to the banks of rivers, causing siltation and raising the water temperature. So the fish populations were getting hammered for lots of reasons. And overfishing was occurring too. Now the federal government and state government pretty much were ignoring all these other things. But something had to happen. Somebody had to be blamed for what was going on with the decline of the salmon population. And guess who got blamed? The Native American fishermen. The Native American fishermen were taking at this time 5% of the total catch. But they were blamed for the overfishing and the reduction in the fish stock. And whenever that was happening, Billy Frank Jr., here our friend, was in the mix. He was there talking and explaining what they were doing was part of their legal treaty rights. And oftentimes when conflict would begin, it would happen at a place on the Nisqually River called Frank's Landing. Billy Frank Jr. This is the Frank family location where they did business, where the Indians would put their boats in the water, pull them out, sell their fish, process their fish. So if there was going to be a conflict, it was going to happen at Frank's Landing. And if it happened at Frank's Landing, guess what? Billy Frank Jr. was going to be there in the midst of it. This is a slide of the Washington Fish and Game officials confiscating a gillnet that belonged to the Native American fishermen. They would come along, confiscate the catch, which was bad enough. But what really hurt was when they would confiscate the nets or the boats or the motors so that the Indians couldn't fish. And they started arresting the fishermen. Billy Frank Jr. was arrested while he was fishing the first time when he was 14 years old, and arrested more than 50 times after that. There's no exact number that's available. I guess we could figure it out if we tried. But he was arrested all the time. He said, I was the getting arrested guy. That was my job. And it was so common. It was so common that if he didn't come home for supper on the day when he was out fishing, his wife would grab one of the kids and give him something of value like a radio or some piece of fishing equipment. Say, take this down to the bail bondsman, get some money, bail your dad out of jail so he can come home and eat supper. That was just the way things happened. And you might expect that somebody who was getting arrested constantly and being harassed for just doing what was legally right would get sullen or angry, resentful. And a lot of people did, but not Billy Frank Jr. Billy Frank Jr. was a natural diplomat, and he loves people, even the ones that were arrested. And his job was, in his mind, was to try to explain the native way of life and the importance of the salmon fishing to whoever would listen. And he tried to get everyone to listen. He greet people with a smile, a firm handshake, and often a hug. Now, it's the late 1960s, and things are getting nasty in the United States. Those of you in the room, there's a few of you who were there when we were. Protests about everything, about the Vietnam War, about civil rights, about women's rights, about freedom to do what you wanted to do, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, whatever it might be. And the Indian fishing issues got mixed up with all of that. So more and more people were attracted to the riverbanks when there was a conflict between the state of Washington's Fish and Game and the Indians. and to participate in these protests. It got to be a bigger and bigger movement. And guess who was always there getting arrested? Billy Frank Jr. Now, this all came to a head on September 9th of 1970, when there was a big confrontation between the Washington fishing game and the Native American fishermen, just on the river just outside of Olympia, Washington. And it was a nasty time. There were shots fired, there were fire bombs exploded, this bridge was built, tear gas was deployed. 60 people were arrested, got lots of attention. Here's the interesting thing, as Billy Frank Jr. said, there was somebody else on the bank of the river that got gas that day too. And his name was Stan Pitkin. Stan Pitkin was the federal attorney for Western Washington State. And he saw what happened and he said, enough. So 2 weeks later, from this event, federal government filed charges against this Washington State Fish and Game for the abrogation of the Indian treaty rights. And a court case was created. The judge who was in charge of this court case was Hugo Bolt. And he presided over all the legal machinations and everything for 4 years. And guess what? Every time there was a hearing, every time there was a chance to tell the Indian story, guess who was in Hugo Bolt's pocket? Billy Frank Jr. They became friends, colleagues, they worked together to work through all this. So 4 years after it all started, Hugo Bolt issued his decision on just 2 days before Valentine's Day in 1974. He said three things that were critically important. One, the Indians' rights had been violated. Now, everybody by this time expected that that would be the result. The second thing was there was expected allocation of the fish catch to the Native American. Remember, they're taking 5% of the catch. Everybody expected that they would be awarded 5% of the catch. But Hugo Bolt said, nah, you get half the catch. Half the fish catch in these western rivers belong to the Native Americans, half to everybody else. See, there were two sovereign nations that were dealing, the Native Americans and the state and federal government. Well, this decision made everybody go nuts. And so here we see Judge Bolt being burned in effigy on the courthouse lawn in Olympia, Washington. And you can read what a non-Native American fisherman said about the Indian fishermen. Well, it went through years of appeals and other kinds of legal stuff. That's a technical. And the Supreme Court was involved 2 times. Every time Hugo Bolt was upheld. So this became the law of the land. Now here's the third part. Now these two things that Judge Bolt decided are really important. But the third one I always think is the critical one. Because he said from now on, these two sides of this story will co-manage the fisheries together. No longer does the state of Washington make all the decisions about these fisheries. Now, the Indians and the non-Indians are going to have to get together, make decisions about all the things that affect the fishery. You know, when the fishery opens, when it closes, how big the catch should be. And it changed everything. To represent the Native American side, there was a group called the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission that was created. And guess who was in charge of it? Billy Frank Jr. For 30 years, except for a few months at one interval, Billy Frank Jr. was the head of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission and the lead fishery biologist for the Native Americans. And together, working with the state of Washington and the federal government, they would craft every year the rules for managing fisheries. But in order to do this together, they had to share information, and it had to be shared openly. So a whole series of new management tools had to be developed in order to understand how many fish were going to be available to catch. All the things that we in fisheries know about: harvest rates, recruitment models, stock assessment, real-time monitoring of the catches so that you knew when to blow the whistle and say stop fishing, more fish culture. And all of that stuff was negotiated together and done together, making the salmon fisheries of our Pacific coast the most researched, most investigated, best known fishery in the world. And those techniques that were developed to solve this have spread throughout the world as important parts of the management of fishery. And so, from the humble beginnings of Billy Frank Jr. being the getting arrested guy on the banks of the river, he became what is called the International Ambassador for Salmon, because he was the central negotiator on behalf of the Native Americans for everything that went on. And he negotiated with the state of Washington, with the US federal government, later with the government of Canada, Japan, Russia, because those salmon stocks are shared across the Northern Pacific. With timber companies about how they should manage their properties, with power companies about how they should manage the dams. So here's this guy, by his passion and his persistence, who created a whole new world of fisheries management for the people of the United States and the world. And it's interesting, he got every award you could imagine. They kept rolling in, including posthumously the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian award we have in the United States. But I think what's particularly interesting is what had been the Nisqually National Wildlife Refuge was renamed after him. And you can't see it, the tree is gone now, but right behind here and a little bit to that side is the location where that treaty tree stood, and where the treaty representing the Native Americans was signed. And because of that, salmon populations in the Pacific Northwest are so much better managed than they were before. They're coming back in abundance in general. And there's enough for the commercial fishermen, the recreational fishermen, the Native American fishermen, and also for the natural fishermen of Katmai National Park. Okay, 2 down, third and the last to go. We want to go halfway around the world to the nation of Kenya, so we can talk about this woman, Wangari Maathai, who did something truly, truly remarkable. I'm not going to tell you what it was yet, and keep you in suspended suspense. I was going to say suspended animation. That's not right. Suspended suspense. Now, Wangari Maathai was born in 1939 in the central highlands of Kenya. It was a wonderful place. When she writes about her childhood, she lived in a small village which was based on subsistence farming. This portion of Kenya has good soils, moderate climate, ample clean water. She really loved being there, called herself a child of the soil right from the beginning. Well, not everything was great for women in Africa in the 1930s and 40s. For one thing, they couldn't vote. For the other thing, they did all the hard work while the men watched. Third thing is they didn't generally go to school. Wangari Maathai was a fortunate young lady, because one day when their mother was getting her brothers ready to go off to school, one of her brothers said, "Hey, why doesn't Wangari go to school with us?" And her mother didn't have a good answer. So she said, "Wangari, put your shoes on, you're going to school." And so she started going to school, and she never stopped. She was the best student in elementary school, the best student in middle school, high school. Now, it's 1962, 63. And in Africa, all these countries that had been colonies of Europe are getting their independence, including Kenya was in line to get its independence. And folks in Europe and the United States recognized that they would need educated folks from those countries, young people, to take positions of power and authority to manage the independence. And so we brought many students from Africa to the United States at that time. And Wangari Maathai was fortunate to be chosen. Perhaps she wasn't fortunate; she was the best student anybody had ever seen. So it'd be ridiculous not to bring her here. And so she came to the United States, went to Kansas to study for a bachelor's degree at the St. Scholastica College for Women in Atchison, Kansas. And it's now called Benedictine College. And she was a great student there as well. Here you see her in a biology class and in her dorm room. She liked it so much, they liked her so much that she stayed and got a master's degree at the University of Pittsburgh. Now, it was time to go back to Kenya and take her role as part of the new generation. And she went back to Kenya with the offer of a job, be an assistant professor in the veterinary school in Nairobi. First woman ever hired of such a nature. She eventually became a full professor, first one ever to do that in Africa. First woman to become chair of it, everything was a first for Wangari Maathai. Now, but early on, and the story is a lot more convoluted than that, believe me, a lot harder. And when you get your copy of the book later, you can read more about it. When she went back, one of her first jobs was to go out in the countryside and survey cattle for parasites and other sorts of diseases. And when she went out doing that, she found a Kenya that looked very different from the one she knew as a child. In place of these small villages with subsistence farms, there were now huge tea plantations and huge loblolly and eucalyptus plantations for export as well. And because of that, people didn't grow their own food. They worked for these companies at low wages and had to go to the store and buy their food at high prices. So instead of being well fed and happy, they were poorly nourished, they were malnourished, and they were disheartened. They had to walk, instead of there being a local stream, those had been dried up in the process, they had to walk miles and hours every day to get water, and miles and every day to get firewood as well. So Wangari Maathai saw this situation where these small communities were now suffering greatly. And she said, this is my kingdom. I have to do something about it. I need to change this. She didn't know what to do at first. And then she said, one day it just came to me. Why don't we plant trees? And she began the process of planting trees in partnership with others. She would get together with small groups of rural women from a village and talk to them about the fact that they knew how to plant trees. And I know I'm talking to a forestry department here, and this always makes me a little nervous because she said, you don't need a forestry degree to plant a tree. You just put some seeds in the ground, give them some water, keep the seeds away from the chickens and the goats, and you can grow trees. And then you can plant them out into the local environment to regrow local wood lots with local species. Because in Kenya, in a few years, those trees are yielding fruit. They're yielding wood. They're stabilizing the soil. And so she would do this, and she would go from community to community and work with these small groups. I always did it just that. I get tongue-tied and I say groups of small women. The women were all sizes, but there were small groups of rural women that she worked with. And as these small groups would talk to one another in other villages, she would get more and more requests. So what started small started rolling into a big effort and a big consequence. Pretty soon there were dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of these small groups in rural areas of Kenya. And as her fame grew, she got asked to do more of this and more of this and more of this. And she continued to do so. And then, I don't know whether I made this point effectively, but what Wangari Maathai saw was that if you could get the women working in their village, growing their own trees, taking over the responsibility for this, that they would get more interested in their local communities in other ways. And so the self-determination would begin to rise again. And so she was happy to also participate in other advocacy for other things. Now here she's sitting in a place where she used to have marches and protests and demonstrations in a place called Uhuru Park, which is like the Central Park of Nairobi, right in the middle. And there were issues because the president was starting to cut the trees down to build them a big old building and a statue of himself. And Wangari Maathai said, no, I don't think so. She would have these protest marches and they would often turn violent. I mean, here she is. So another thing that was going on was the government would take public lands, public forests, and deed them over to rich people, and they put up walls and start cutting down the trees to develop the thing. And Wangari Maathai and her friends would get in there and they would start planting trees where they'd been cut down. And here she is on her way to protest. She's got her tree planting fork here, and you can see this group of armed archers waiting to attack her. These attacks often became very violent. And there was one instance that she talks about where she had a significant head wound from being attacked and was taken in and had to sign the police report. So he just reached up in her scalp, got a good supply of blood, and signed her arrest warrant in her own blood. Well, she started planting these trees. She started getting everyone excited. And at first, the government thought this was going to go away. She was a nuisance. But then they realized it wasn't going to go away, and they said, she's a problem. And then finally, the government declared her to be an enemy of the state. She was on the assassination list. She had to go underground for months at a time to stay ahead of the police that were chasing her. Her friend said, Wangari, go to the United States. They know you there. Go there and make your case there where it's safe. She said, no, I'm a Kenyan woman. I belong in Kenya doing this job. Here she is being dragged out of, well, she's not being dragged out right now. She's being taken out by her supporters. But she was in jail for 2 weeks in a cold, damp, dark cell. At this point, she had serious arthritis and had to be carried out. And it was only because the international press had gotten hold of this story that eventually the authorities let her go. When she got out, she thought she was never going to be able to walk again, and neither did her supporters. And when she got outside being carried, there was a big sign that said, Wangari, you will never walk alone again. Now they like I said, they told her to go someplace else where it was safe. She said, no, I belong here. I belong here, continuing to teach people how to plant trees. And she did. She kept on going until she had accomplished this thing that's really amazing. She and her partners in these groups planted 50 million trees in Kenya. 50 million. You know, originally they had a goal of 1 tree for every Kenyan. There were about 30 million people in Kenya at the time. So basically they got close to double that. And she also was responsible for planting tens of millions of trees in adjacent countries that never got counted. It was truly a remarkable thing. And if you go to Uhuru Park in Nairobi right now, you will find this sign, getting rusty, but at a place called Freedom Corner, where she used to have her protests and her demonstrations, that says, and I forgot to mention, but her thing that she was doing was called the Green Belt Movement. Still, it's called the Green Belt Movement. And where they recognize her contributions, say, let us never forget it. Oh, and she picked up a little prize, a little award for her work, which was the 2004 Nobel Peace Prize. The first woman in Africa ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The first person to ever win the Nobel Peace Prize for environmental things. The Nobel Committee recognized, and as represented by her work, that you could never have a peaceful world unless the people were secure in their day-to-day life. Unless there was a stable, secure, good environment, there wasn't going to be peace. There isn't going to be peace. And I think the true character of Wangari Maathai is shown. And when she heard that she was going to get the Nobel Peace Prize, she was riding in a car between events in Kenya, and she was going to a hotel. And when she got there, all the people had heard about this. And so all the guests, all the staff, everybody was out in front of the hotel when the car drove up, and she got out of the car. And they're all yelling, screaming, and clapping, and really happy. And someone said, Wangari, how can we help you celebrate this momentous occasion? And she said, as she surely would say, bring me a shovel, let's plant a tree. 50 million and what? Well, that's the story I've been wanting to tell you this morning, now this afternoon. The story of these courageous and perhaps improbable people, Chico Mendes, Billy Frank Jr., and Wangari Maathai, who used their passion, their persistence, and their partnerships to change our world in a significant way. And I just think it would be wonderful if the next time someone writes a book like this, they don't feature 8 people, but they feature 9. And the 9th one is you. Thank you very much for listening. I didn't even mean
Happy questions.
Yes.
Right now, there's a lot of tension between indigenous people and the forestry company, because we're doing many of the things that you described. Nothing, like, to me, nothing has changed, right? Because we talked about the past. What can we do about the future, about the movement of people that, improbable that are leaders, or they're grassroots leaders, but how can we as foresters and scientists help these movements? Rebecca.
So the question is, how can we help things get farther along than they've gotten so far? And the example in Chile, they're not getting as far as they should. So the answer to it is simple and hard. The answer is keep at it, stay committed, take every opportunity you can to help those who are doing the right thing. And recognize, I think, also that in many ways, this is a 2-step forward, 1-step back situation. And actually, I was encouraged just yesterday. I was reading the news that the nation of Suriname just announced that their new policy is to protect 97% of the forest in their country. And wow, that's really a commitment. Now, Suriname is one of the still remaining most forested places in the world. There's been little impact on the rainforest, but they're saying proactively right now, we're gonna keep it that way. And, you know, others are saying, yeah, well, there's not enough enforcement, there's not enough this, there's not enough that, and that's true. So if Suriname only can do 90%, well, okay. So I think it's not to be discouraged, not to, yeah. I mean, what can I say? You know, if I was wearing a Nike shirt, I'd say, you know, just do it. Bit of a cop out, but it's the answer. Thank you. Yeah.
Larry, how did you decide on just those 8 for your book?
Well, that's an interesting question. Because when I set out to write this book, I said, I'm going to write 12 biographies. And then when I got 6 done, I said, you know, 10 would be enough. Then when I got 8 done, I said, well, 8 would be enough. You know, and so I stopped at 8 because they needed to get it done. So interesting, you know, these aren't definitive biographies of these people. You know, a definitive biography of Rachel Carson, this book by Linda Lear that's about this thick. You know, they all are that way, and they take 10 years to write. Well, I didn't have that much time. So they had to be people who had full enough lives, rich enough lives, interesting enough lives that there had been quite a bit written about them. And I could read it all and then extract it down. And that's not an easy task to find that number of people. And I was particularly committed, Rick, that I wasn't going to make this a book full of old dead white guys. Right? So people say sometimes, well, how come Gifford Pinchot's not in there? How come Teddy Roosevelt's not in there? My answer is, once you put John Muir in, you pretty much got that story told. And I wasn't going to do that. I wanted it to be international as well. So that's why it's kind of that way. And then when you start adding in the requirements that there's got to be enough written, etc., the list is pretty small. At one point, I was thinking about putting Diane Fossey in the book. You know, Gorillas in the Mist. And then I started reading about her, and it turns out she was a hard drinking, hard smoking, family wrecking romancer. And Sharon said, "You're not putting her in your book." So you know, sometimes you know, good candidates are out for another reason. It was interesting to me though when Island Press and I were negotiating about this, and I had already written the book before I said, "Hey, will you publish this?" And we had a conversation, and they said, "Why do you have who you have in the book?" And I thought they were upset with me because I had these, you know, these people that I just talked about instead of, and I said, well, you know, they said, no. Why do you have Aldo Leopold and John Muir and Ding Darling in the book? Because these are our household names and all that. I said, well, when I talk to people about who should be in the book, you know, I got some of those names, and I thought that if people were going to pick up the book and be attracted to it, they had to see some familiar names that they, you know, said, oh, well, I like Rachel Carson, you know, and so it, you know, there's a few traditional people in there, and then a few non-traditional. But there's 5 men, 3 women. There's 5 majority, 3 non-majority. There's 4 Americans and 4 international, something like that. I did my best to try to get it spread out. Yeah, sometimes I think about writing another book, and then I decide to write a mystery novel instead.
I was just wondering who were the 4 that you decided to cut? Because you said you started with 12, but then slimmed it down.
Oh no, I didn't have them chosen.
Oh, okay.
It's hard to pick. And it, you know, like Billy Frank Jr., for example. You know, if you look at some of the pictures, they're not the greatest pictures that I got, right? But you know, no one was taking pictures of Chico Mendes when he was young and or ever really very much. No one was taking pictures of Wangari Maathai when she was a kid. So why was I saying that? It's hard to find. Oh, that's right. I was fortunate that just as I was sitting down to write this book, and I wrote to a friend who worked with Native Americans, he said, "Who do you think I might feature?" And he said, "This new biography of Billy Frank Jr. just came out," and so I was fortunate that I was able to get a lot of information. So it's interesting. And Wangari Maathai, she won the Nobel Peace Prize. There is no biography of Wangari Maathai, except like there's little tiny ones for school children. They're like 10 pages with cartoonish pictures. So most of there's lots of magazine articles with her being interviewed and stuff, but she wrote several books, so that's what most of it. Yeah.
Do you know if there was any major change to like when Wangari came home to Kenya and she was seeing the exploitation of all her people and the workers from the industrial plantations? Do we know if there was any major change to that reality?
So the deforestation of Kenya could be complete.
Yeah.
And it was like 5% left. And I haven't looked this up lately, but like 5% left. And since Wangari Maathai, it's like back to 10%.
Yeah.
So there is reforestation that's going on. But to the point that talking about Chile that you talked about, you got the U.S. Tennis Open was just on recently. Right? There's a quote on the wall, one by Arthur Ashe, that says, "Start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can." Yeah. And I think getting from 5 to 10% in Kenya right now is a big deal. So yeah, there's action there.
Okay, let's give another hand to Dr. Please sign up for lunch. Please go to 216. This sandwich is waiting for you.
Yeah, and if you would like to purchase a book, I have some here signed for you, and it's $25 instead of 30 plus tax on Amazon. And yeah, I figured out how to take a credit card. So if you want to do that, fine. If not, have a good day and life.